Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's Bridge Lunch Break event. My name is Jackie Garrett, Fund Development Associate at Bridge, Michigan, your source for nonprofit, nonpartisan news in Michigan. In this event, we'll take your questions about the Bridge teams or about the recent primary elections. Our special guest panelists will include Richard Scuba, founder of the Glenn Gariff Group, Representative Bill G. Schuette, and Representative Penelope Cerniglu from the Michigan legislature as well. Politics reporter Lauren Gibbons will moderate this discussion. Our conversation will begin in just a moment, and Lauren will start the discussion with questions for Richard and then shift to Representative Cerniglu and Representative Schuette, and then we'll turn to your questions that you submit during this event. Please type any questions you have for our panelists into the chat window at any time. If you're not a panelist, please remain muted throughout today's discussion. We are recording today's conversation. It will be posted to Bridge, Michigan this week. You can subscribe to our newsletters by visiting www.bridgemi.com and click subscribe. Events like this one are made possible by the support of Bridge members. If you'd like to join this membership community, we'll drop a link to do so in the chat. A reminder, please stay muted throughout this conversation. I'll now pass it over to Lauren to get us started.
Sounds great. Thanks, Jackie. Well, yeah, so happy to start here with a conversation with Richard from Glenn Gariff Group, pollster extraordinaire, watching these primary races in the general election cycle. So we didn't see a whole ton of surprises in this primary election. We've got the Slotkin versus Rogers Senate race, narrowed down some congressional contests, set the stage for a fight for the majority in the state house. But just to kick us off, what was your biggest takeaway from the primary results we saw last week?
Well, I think I agree. There weren't a lot of big picture messages coming out of this primary, but what caught my attention, what I was paying attention to, was Ottawa County, and specifically what was happening to Ottawa Impact, which is a group of elected officials who took over the Ottawa County Board of Commissioners 2 years ago. And, Ottawa County is a Republican county, and frankly, it's known as a good governance county. They've always, had this reputation of really stable, effective governance over there. That has not been the case the last 2 years with Ottawa Impact. Tons of lawsuits, tons of problems. And so I wanted to see what was going to happen there. And sure enough, it appears Ottawa Impact has lost their majority on that board. I paid attention to this because I think it reflects kind of a bigger thing we're seeing on the Republican side, specifically in primaries, of what I'd call kind of the conservative mainstream Republicans versus the Trump MAGA Republicans in a lot of ways, of division. And what some of the lessons we learned here were, it's tough to beat an incumbent, not just in Ottawa County, but also across the state. Barring some major scandal, which in one state rep seat, we did have a major scandal where that rep lost. The other thing is, I think in Republican primaries, what Ottawa County showed is to defeat kind of these far right candidates, it requires independents and some Democrats to cross over and vote in those primaries. That's what we saw take place in Ottawa County, where the Dem turnout in Ottawa County was really low. It's because a lot of them were pulling Republican ballots. So that caught my attention in terms of the primary night.
Mm-hmm. And to follow up on what we saw in Ottawa County, is there anything we can extrapolate that could portend for future elections, or is this more just a showcase of some of the voters' concerns about what happened with Ottawa Impact?
Well, I put Ottawa County in kind of a unique situation in that it very much was what I'd call a far right government that had taken over that county. It wasn't, I would not call Ottawa Impact standard Republican elected officials. And when you broaden out what we saw in Ottawa County, we're seeing this take place worldwide, actually. We've seen it in places like Poland, which I think was the first to send this message, that if you wanted to defeat a far-right government, it would take all the officials or all the voters from the center and the left join together to defeat those far-right candidates. The same happened in France, where Le Pen's party was beaten because the center and the far left hung together. In Ottawa County, where those Ottawa Impact members were defeated, we saw the same thing happen. We saw Republican voters, kind of mainstream Republican voters, independents, and Democrats come together to oust those Ottawa Impact members. So that, I think, we can extrapolate for how to defeat what I'd call far-right governments, not Republican, far-right. There's a difference.
Mm-hmm. And in other respects, there was quite a bit for voters to digest ahead of the primary, with Vice President Harris taking over the Democratic presidential ticket, taking Joe Biden's place at the top of the Democratic presidential nomination. And how have the dynamics changed in Michigan since that transpired? And, you know, what does that mean for momentum from either party in the coming months?
You know, I think we need to take a step back. And every conversation I have regarding this election starts with the same message. Nothing we're seeing this year is normal. Absolutely nothing. Do not forget that. You know, let's just we started the year with two incumbent presidents or two presidents running against each other. First time in our lifetime that has happened. The question I had all along was, who would be viewed as the incumbent? And we started to see the answer to that as the campaign progressed. But then we saw one of the candidates, Donald Trump, convicted on 34 counts, felony counts. We saw an epic debate collapse by Joe Biden the end of June. We saw Joe Biden pull out in July, a month before the convention. And let's not forget, we had an assassination attempt in the middle of all that. I jokingly like to say that 50, 60 years from now, this is going to be some high school students' absolute horror on a multiple choice test, because nobody's going to believe all of these things happened in a 2-month period. That's how unusual we're seeing this election. So let's step back in January, when we did our first survey for the election cycle here in Michigan, we found Donald Trump with an 8-point lead on Joe Biden. And why that is so unusual is because in all of our surveying, we've never showed Donald Trump leading a survey in Michigan. And it was Craig Mauger from the Detroit News who pointed that out to me, that all of our surveys had never had Donald Trump leading, may have had him close, but never had him leading. And here we had him up by 8 points. The shocking number in that survey was Joe Biden's reelect, which specifically amongst independent voters was only 7%. And there aren't many numbers as a pollster that my jaw just drops, but that one, my jaw dropped. A 7% reelect amongst independents in a state that is decided by independents was a jaw-dropping number. So kind of where are we now? You know, we went into the field on day 1, 2, and 3 of the Harris campaign. So right at the start of this happened, and we had the race suddenly, you know, at 41-41 tied, with Kennedy getting nearly 10%. The one thing I'll say to everybody watching, any polls that do not include Kennedy in that presidential head-to-head are simply not going to be accurate, because he is taking a chunk of that vote. And do I think he's going to end up taking 10%? Absolutely not. But the story of this election moving forward is, where does his vote go? Because Michigan is decided by independents, the 20% of voters in the center. And those independents were actually choosing Kennedy in first place of those three contenders. That's going to shift, and that's going to tell the story of this race. I think it's important that whether you have Trump up by 2 or Harris up by 2, the margin of error of any survey means this race is dead even in Michigan. And until we start to see otherwise, Michigan is a toss-up state. And nothing is more Michigan than making presidential candidates come into this state and fight for the middle. And so that's going to be a really interesting thing that we're going to watch moving forward. I think some of the things that we should look ahead at that are really going to have an impact are, one, we have the Democratic National Convention. Typically, Democrats come off, or any party comes off their convention with a bounce. Donald Trump did not come off with a bounce simply because there was so much disruption after their convention with Harris becoming the nominee. And so the question is, does Harris come out with a bounce that moves her slightly ahead? Their risk, the protests that may occur in Chicago. I think it's going to be very interesting to watch how that plays out. Second, September 10th. I'm not usually big on debates. I think they're more show than anything. But that September 10th debate is going to be consequential because it'll be the first time many Americans see Vice President Harris in that kind of give and take. I think is going to be a highly watched debate. And then the third factor is the potential of sentencing of Donald Trump for those felony convictions. Whether it happens or not before the election, we don't know yet. But what impact does that have? And then finally, the thing I'll mention is, as we look forward, nothing's normal. Expect nothing to be normal. Expect the unexpected to occur over the next several months.
I certainly have also thought about the future high school students thinking about this on a history exam, because sometimes I'm just I'm shocked that I am living through all of this too. So we talked a lot about independent voters and their importance in Michigan, and then another factor that we often hear about when forecasting Michigan political results for either party is turnout among party faithful, but also, just turnout generally. And is there anything that we can take away from last week's primary results and some of the trends that we're seeing in the latest polling that can tell us about where voters are at, and whether we may see a high turnout election in the fall?
I don't know that we saw anything come out of the primary that talked to that, but we're certainly seeing indications of what we can expect. I said earlier, about 20% of Michigan voters call themselves true independents. And that means they'll flip back and forth. It's kind of what makes Michigan so much fun as you're a pollster, because we don't have party registration in this state. And so people can flip back and forth depending on how they're viewing each election. They're the ballgame. That 20% is going to make all the decisions in this state. And I know we pay a lot of attention to the ballot tests, the head-to-head question between the candidates. But as a pollster, what I pay a lot of attention to is the motivation to vote. And we ask this question on a 1 to 10 scale: how motivated are you to vote in November? Higher the number, the more the motivation. Well, we were seeing going into late June, it was about an 8.9 on a 10-point scale, which is good motivation. It's not as high as 2020, about maybe 2018, 22 levels, but not as high as we saw 4 years ago. Well, that's all changed. Based on our latest survey after Biden stepped aside and Harris took over, our motivation to vote is now coming in at a 9.5 on a 10-point scale. And it is across the board. Democrats, Republicans, independents, everybody is motivated to vote. I think one of the things Donald Trump deserves credit for is the way he motivates voters to vote, either for him or against him. I mean, there's no in between, and people turn out to vote. And I want to give you some kind of perspective about what that number means, that 9.5 that we're seeing right now. So back in 2016, when we had the Clinton-Trump race, we asked this number, and we were stunned because we were seeing the lowest numbers we had ever seen, certainly I had ever seen in 40 years of polling Michigan. And give you some sense of what that was, The base Democrats were at 6-7. Base Republicans were at 6-6, about the same. But it was those centrists. You had leaning Republicans at 6-2, the moderate Republicans, but leaning Democrats were at 4-7. And the independent vote was at 5-6. I'd never seen independent voters so unmotivated to vote as they were in 2016. So what are we seeing right now? Amongst base Democrats, it's 9-5, base Republicans 9-8. Leaning Democrats 9-1, leaning Republicans 9-2, independents 9.0. We are going to see a very high turnout in this election. Voters are now really energized. We've been seeing in all the numbers and all the polling, there was a wide swath of voters that weren't satisfied with either of their choices. And when Biden dropped out, suddenly their motivation shot through the roof, those double haters. They've been given a new choice. And so, you know, I said earlier, who was going to be the incumbent? Was it going to be Biden or Trump? Well, suddenly Biden's out of the race and voters are viewing Vice President Harris more and more as the change agent. And that's going to be a challenge for the Trump campaign moving forward, I think.
Mm-hmm. And then my last question for you is about some of the down ballot races that are also pretty important in Michigan and also expected to be very competitive. We have a U.S. Senate matchup, several contested congressional districts, and a lot of competitive seats at the state house level. And you know, I'm curious how some of these major changes at the top of the ticket will impact those down ballot races. But we also had a reader question asking if some of these local candidates could also create some kind of coattails effect, particularly for Harris.
Well, let's start with the U.S. Senate race. It's rare for Michigan to get an open U.S. Senate seat. But the last time Republicans won a Senate seat in Michigan was 1994, when Spence Abraham beat Bob Carr. And that, I will note, that was the midterm election of the first Clinton term, which was let's face it, any midterm is bad tends to be bad for an incumbent president, the first midterm. We haven't seen a Republican win that. The reality is Michigan leans Democratic slightly in U.S. Senate seats. And I think right now that's what we're seeing in the U.S. Senate race. Our numbers had Slotkin leading by 5 points by Rogers. That was before primary day. I think that is probably, you know, what you would expect it to look like at this stage. But, you know, when you look at these two candidates, for Rogers, the race needs to be close. And if this race remains close, he stands, and there's an opportunity for him to win. If this race starts to widen, for example, if Michigan starts to look like Michigan looks and Democrats start to take a lead in the presidential race, for example, I think that's bad news for Rogers. It's good news for Slotkin. Slotkin is also really well-versed at running at independents. She has won 2 elections now in slightly Republican seat by winning those independents so handily. So she's good at this, and she's going to have the resources. I question how many resources Mike Rogers is going to have. As you look at the playing field nationwide, there's a lot of opportunities for Republicans to pick up U.S. Senate seats. And you look at Ohio, Montana, Arizona, clearly West Virginia is going to flip. There's some other seats there. So nationwide, Republicans have to ask, how logical is it to invest in Michigan huge sums that it's going to require Rogers to have to win that seat? As you go further down on the congressional seats, I think there's 2 seats that are really in play here. One is the 7th, the Lansing seat, Alyssa Slotkin's seat. It's Curtis Hertel versus Tom Barrett. I think this is actually going to tell us a lot about the U.S. House. This is a slightly Republican seat. It's the seat I mentioned that Alyssa Slotkin had. This is going to be just a barn burner of a race, frankly, and one to keep your eyes on. It could predict where the House goes nationwide. The other one is the 8th, the Kildee seat, where we had Kristen Rivet McDonald now versus Paul Young. That territory, and Representative Schuette knows more about it than I do, I'm sure. That is very much a swing area now. It's become a much more Republican area than it used to be, frankly. And so that's one to watch here. What's going to happen? There's going to be a lot of money poured into that race. In terms of the state house seats, I'm not going to say too much because you have the two experts here to talk about it. But, I think it's important to remember that 2 years ago, Gretchen Whitmer won at the top of the ticket by 10 points, and Democrats just eased out the majority here. So I think the pressure is really on the Democratic side here to hold their majority. The one thing I will say, it is hard to beat an incumbent. It takes a lot of money and a lot of effort to beat an incumbent. So those swing seats that Democrats won, I think it's going to be hard to dislodge them. It's going to take a lot of work. And the one thing that's going to make a lot that I think is going to really matter in these state house races is the ground game of both parties. It's going to be crucial. When we're seeing these massive turnouts, how those independents vote is going to decide these races. And particularly in state house races that are close, you're going to see 150, 200 vote margins in these races deciding the state house. And that's why the ground game in these swing state house seats is going to be crucial.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a perfect segue to our next segment. Thank you so much, Richard. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this with us this afternoon. And yeah, we'll definitely be in touch as we get closer and closer to what is already a historic election. So
good luck to my the colleagues here as they move forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Well, yeah, well, thanks again. And now I'll turn to Representatives Schuette and Cerniglu to talk a little bit more about the state house seats and how intense this upcoming several months is probably going to be for both of you. But I'd like to start just because we are just a week out from the primaries. It basically slimmed down the races for especially in some of these some of the less competitive seats at the general election level. But what were your biggest takeaways from the primary as you look ahead to the general election, which will decide who controls the chamber? And either of you can start. I guess we can go with Rep. Schuette.
Sure, and thank you, Lauren. And it was great to hear Richard's expert opinion earlier, and Penelope. It's great to be with you here as well, and I appreciate Bridge for the invitation. So obviously, historic elections, and we had a big primary last week. My big takeaway as chairman of the House Republican Campaign Committee is, Republicans the last few cycles we've been pretty used to waking up the day after the primaries, taking out a marker and crossing off seats that we no longer are able to play in because of the types of candidates that we've had come through the primaries. That's not the case this time. Thankfully, the House Republican Campaign Committee has a fantastic slate of candidates that won our primaries. From Marquette to Monroe, we have a great group of candidates who fit their districts like a glove, are going to be able to take the message to voters, go and win, and take back the state house for Republicans this November.
And Rep. Cerniglu, how about you? What did you see in the primary cycle for Democrats?
Sure. So a few things, if you'll bear with me. Despite the absence of any really close matchups at the top of the ticket, Democratic turnout was actually very high compared to Republican turnout. So that tells me Democrats are excited and they're voting. And Democrats are taking advantage of early voting and absentee voting at a much higher rate than Republicans. All of our Democratic incumbents in the state house won their primaries. And as we were told earlier, that is usually the case, that incumbents are strong, but our incumbents didn't just win, they won big against all of their challengers. So what that tells me is that Michiganders share our democratic values and priorities of putting money back in people's pockets, making critical investments in public safety, education, economic development, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, protecting our environment, protecting our kids from gun violence, and perhaps most notably, protecting our reproductive rights, which is a really big one for me. And in fact, our House Republicans are so out of touch with the majority of Michigan voters that every single one of them voted against the Michigan Family Protection Act, which protects IVF and surrogacy agreements in Michigan. So I think the primary results are just telling us that we're doing all the right things by putting people first in Michigan, and that Michigan voters support what our House Democratic majority has already been doing. Thanks.
And Representative Cerniglu, just to follow up on that, we heard a little bit earlier today about just the presence of Vice President Harris on the ticket, and that happening shortly before Michigan's primary was obviously pretty close to the top of mind for voters. I think Walz was named the day of the primary. So from your perspective, are House Democrats better positioned to protect recent gains in Michigan now that President Biden is out of the race?
Absolutely, yes. Just last week, I took my family to the Harris-Walz rally at the airport, and I haven't seen so much grassroots excitement since the Obama rallies in 2008. That crowd was fired up. And former President Trump was so terrified of the excitement generated by Harris and Walz at the top of the ticket that he claimed the crowd was AI generated, which is completely absurd. So I believe Trump has reached his ceiling here in Michigan, and the Harris-Walz ticket is just getting started. So here in Michigan, I'm confident that Democrats are going to win up and down the ballot. Democrats are putting people first, and we're working for the people. And when we work for the people, everyone wins. So not only are we now in a great position to hold our majority, but we're in a very real position. We have a very real shot to not only hold our majority in the state house, but to expand our majority. And we are absolutely focusing on doing just that come this November.
And Representative Schuette, I'll let you respond to that, but also curious to hear what, if anything, this changes for Republicans on the ballot this year, and how whether former President Trump and other high-profile Republicans like Mike Rogers can make sufficient inroads among independent voters to help House Republicans.
Yeah, and thank you, Lauren. And fundamentally, I don't think that this race has changed. We have seen Democrats on a little bit of a sugar high, and they have a certain degree of increased enthusiasm in their base. That's because they went from a candidate and a president who unfortunately could barely string together sentences on a debate stage or at a press conference to a candidate who can cross that very low bar. So it's not a surprise that Democrats who are in a state of near depression with the top of the ticket are now excited about that change. But that doesn't change the fundamentals of the race in the swing voters or the independent voters in Michigan. It just helps them coalesce they're already in the bank Democrat voters. So I'm not concerned about that. And what I'd also say is the areas of the state where House Republicans need to go and win, the areas of the state where this race is going to be decided, from the presidential race to the U.S. Senate race to our hotly competitive congressional races, those are all areas of the state where the independent voters aren't going to be persuaded by the far left radical agenda of the Harris administration, her ideas like abolishing cash bail and mass amnesty for illegal immigrants. Those aren't things that appeal to swing voters in the state of Michigan, and those will, be key wedge issues that we see in this election. And when it comes to the state house, this election is going to be about the price of groceries, which are going through the roof. Americans are categorically better off under the presidency of Donald Trump than they've been in the failed Biden-Harris administration. It's going to be about the disastrous Green New Deal energy legislation that the Democrats rammed through that's going to ban natural gas in the state of Michigan and have huge impacts on the cost of heating your home in Michigan. And it's about the bad education budget that was passed that cuts funding for school safety. I mean, that's something that's near and dear to every family's heart in Michigan and across our state. And I think those are going to be part of the reasons why House Republicans win and take back the gavel this election.
And Representative Schuette just mentioned some of the issues that Republicans will really be focusing on during this cycle. And I know you mentioned reproductive rights earlier, but are there any issues that that House Democrats are really taking to the polls and working to convince voters on?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, I think that our message of putting people first resonates with Michigan voters. We are keeping our kids safe from gun violence. We're providing clean drinking water in schools. We are giving tax cuts to seniors and those who need it most, protecting our environments, investments in education, infrastructure, economic development. And I'm going to say reproductive rights. I'm going to say that again, because that's important. And it's important to me. I don't usually like to make these things personal, but I'm going to make it personal. I'm an IVF mom. And if I didn't have access to IVF and fertility care, my family wouldn't exist as it does today. And if Republicans had their way in our state and nationally, millions of women, families, would-be parents like myself would be denied the right to fertility care. And I know that Republicans they're backing off this issue now because they know that polling shows that everyone, voters, support IVF care. But make no mistake and let their actions speak louder than their words every chance Republicans have in the Michigan House, federally, at the top of the ticket. They want to ban abortions and they want to take away our reproductive rights. Michigan Democrats will protect reproductive rights. But that is an important issue. But of course, we have other issues. And we believe our issues of putting people first, protecting things like healthcare, drinking water, kids from gun violence, and providing tax relief where it's most needed, we think that those issues resonate with Michigan residents.
And Representative Schuette, I noticed you had a pretty strong reaction to some of Representative Cerniglu's comments regarding reproductive rights. And would you care to respond to that and where Republicans are at on this issue here in Michigan, especially when it comes to IVF?
Oh yeah, just because it's not true, right? You know, surrogacy was legal, surrogacy remains legal, and surrogacy will be legal, and IVF will and should remain legal in the state of Michigan. That's something that I support as a Republican, and I know my Republican colleagues support as well. So that's not on the table, and it shows you how desperate Democrats are right now, that they are trying to play alarmism over reproductive rights when we have a constitutional amendment right now that guarantees the right of an abortion in the state of Michigan. So there's nothing legislatively on the table in this election that has anything to do with abortion or surrogacy. And the fact that they are going to that well shows you that they're trying to play to voters' fears, and they have no hopeful aspirational agenda to run on. And that's because they passed an education budget that cuts more than 90% of funding for school safety programs in our public schools in Michigan. You can't say you want to protect our kids in schools and then slash funding for school safety. And you can't. The issues when I'm knocking on doors, whether it's in my own district in mid-Michigan, in Macomb County, in Traverse City, I'm hearing that voters are fed up with the price of their groceries. They don't like that their home heating bills and air conditioning bills are going through the roof. And all that Michigan Democrats have done is give billions of dollars to Chinese companies with ties to the Chinese Communist Party and make life more expensive and harder to start a business in the state of Michigan.
Representative Cerniglu, would you care to respond to that?
Sure. So we can't talk about, supporting school safety when Republicans vote against every gun violence bill that comes across the board that are specifically designed to protect our kids and all of our citizens. And Republicans vote no consistently on all of this. And then they talk about how they want to keep our kids safe. And I heard the word alarmism. But before that, I heard talk of illegal immigrants. Well, Republicans are absolutely using this term illegal immigrants to cause alarmism. We had a representative mistake the Gonzaga men's basketball team for a busload of illegal immigrants. So let's not talk about alarmism here. Republicans would all vote no on putting abortion and reproductive health care into our Constitution, and have, in fact, done that. So any suggestion that Republicans are supporting reproductive rights or would support reproductive rights is just completely just false and absurd. So I think that voters can see what Democrats have traditionally supported and what Republicans have supported. I think that we all can come together and we can all say that we want to provide relief for people when they buy their groceries. We want to put money back into people's pockets. We want to support everyday Michiganders and not just the wealthiest of people. That's something I think we can and should come together on. And I believe that Democrats are doing a better job at all of those things right now. And we want to continue more of the same. And we invite the Republicans to join us in that, instead of just voting no on things to vote no and to be obstructionists. I mean, this is a totally different topic, but Republicans voted no on ending child marriage. How ridiculous is that? The Republican caucus agrees to vote no on things that make absolutely no sense to vote no on. So let's work together and let's not just be the party of no or obstructionism. And let's just all try to work towards a better Michigan together. And I hope we can do more of that when we're reelected in the fall.
I want to quickly interject here and just remind our viewers that if you have any questions for our representatives on the call today, feel free to put them in the chat. I've got a couple here, but happy to take them now if you're interested in weighing in. And I also just want to remind our viewers, Michigan is currently at a 56-54 Democratic majority. All 110 districts are up for grabs, but who wins the majority will ultimately come down to a handful of some of these most competitive districts. And I'd really like to hear from both of our panelists today, just about what the strategy is, but also how representatives in some of these very competitive districts are really trying to reach out to voters and kind of make some of the issues that have been brought up on this call already at the top of mind, especially when there's so many other races to be thinking about. And I guess Rep. Schutte, feel free to start.
Yeah, and thanks, Lauren. And just to first address some of the remarks Penelope mentioned is, first off, illegal immigration is not an alarmist issue. The crisis on our southern border has real consequences right here in mid-Michigan, right here in across our state. I was an intelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency, specifically working on counter-drug operations. So I'm familiar with how the cartels flood Chinese fentanyl over our southern borders, and how that hammers on my way to Lansing every day. I drive through Porter Township, Homer Township in Midland County. They're just being absolutely hammered by the opioid and fentanyl epidemic that is made incredibly worse by the crisis on our southern border. And so these are real issues that matter to Michiganders, and it's our duty as a government to provide solutions to that. As far as the strategy goes for how House Republicans are going to win this election, Lauren, I like to say that elections are difficult, but they're not complicated, right? They're a lot of hard work, but we know the things that we need to do to win in an election. That includes fundraising. House Republicans have had record fundraising. We actually have more cash on hand than like our colleagues and the Democrats do in the caucus funds. And that's important because, as Richard said, the Democrats are going to have to defend a map in an environment that is much less favorable to them than it was last election. But it takes resources to get that message across. And fundraising is a continual task, but investors across the state of Michigan are choosing to invest in the Republican brand and the Republican message because they want to bring balance back to Lansing. And they've seen the damage that Democrat trifecta can do to the ability to open a business or start a family in our state. And, we have great candidates that we're going to highlight. Each one of our candidates fits their district like a glove and has, but whether it's their positions on certain issues or their backgrounds, their ties to the communities, they're going to be able to take their message, persuade, win those races. The Democrat candidates in the swing seats, they're some of the most liberal members in the Democrat caucus, represent some of the most toss-up seats. So those are going to be a distinction that we highlight as a caucus. And again, these things are hard. They're not complicated. It's a lot of knocking doors, getting out the vote operation. I'm looking forward to wearing out my pair of walking shoes along with our caucus and our hardworking team of volunteers.
And Representative Cerniglu, what is your caucus doing to defend the party's work in the legislature, but also to get people interested in state house races?
Absolutely. So, like the Republican caucus, we are doing all the things. We're raising funds, and we actually have a higher combined, Michigan House Democrats have a higher combined total of cash on hand. At the last reporting deadline, I believe Michigan Democrats had 9.3 million and Michigan House Republicans had 8.5 million. I guess it depends how you break the numbers out. But our candidates outraised their Republican opponents, almost every single one of them, with the exception of Matt Hall, they outraised them 2-1, 3-1, in some cases 5-1. That's because people are responding to our Democratic candidates and our Democratic messages. So we have the funds, we're knocking the doors, we are well positioned. Each of our candidates is well positioned to have aggressive TV, digital, radio, mail, field programs in every targeted district across the state. So we're doing all the things. As Representative Schuette knows, it's dollars and doors, and we're doing it. But it's also policies, like we talked about before, policies that resonate with Michiganders. For us, it's reproductive health care, keeping our kids safe from gun violence, clean drinking water in our schools, lowering the price of prescription drugs, and really just creating a welcoming state for everyone. And we believe these are the policies that resonate with Michigan voters, and we're ready to take it to the field.
And one thing, I think is on the minds of a lot of voters, not just the past record or where people stand currently. I think, especially when it comes to the state legislature, it'll come down to what the caucus does if the majority, if they get the majority. And so I'd like to hear from both of you. What are the goals if your caucus is successful? If Republicans win majority back, or if Democrats keep the majority, what direction would you take?
Who do you want to go first?
Go ahead. You already started talking.
All right,
there you go. First mover advantage there. Yeah, that's great. And I think, what comes down to for the House Republicans is we want to make a more affordable Michigan, because families across our state are struggling to make ends meet, whether that's, again, at the gas station or the grocery store. And so from a starting point, we want to make sure that we're providing financial relief to Michiganders, make sure that the government's taking less of their money, and that we're being smart and select with the investments we make as a state. So we're not, giving billions of dollars to, companies with ties to the Chinese Communist Party. Instead, we're giving that money back to Michiganders who deserve it. And that means taking steps to get government out of the way to address our housing shortage. Right now, $90,000 to every new home build is government regulation and zoning costs and permitting ties. So we want to make sure we're cutting those bureaucratic elements that are making it more difficult for our economy to grow and to develop. And it's about safe schools. It's about and lowering the cost of energy in our state. Those are all things that Michiganders need in this election. Those are things that the House Republicans can provide.
Representative.
Sure. So I can't speak for the caucus as a whole, but I can tell you, the things that I, personally look forward to, and it's really just to continue doing the things we've been doing, putting people first, expanding access to health care, putting money back in people's pockets where they most need it, keeping our kids safe, funding education, infrastructure, economic development, and housing. Of course, housing. We have to address our housing crisis, and we want to be in a position to move forward and do that. We want to lower the cost of prescription drugs. And when we talk about getting the government out of decisions, we want to get the government out of our reproductive health care decisions and keep it that way. We have so much more to do, protecting the environment. It all just boils down to putting people first and being a welcoming, inclusive place to live, somewhere we want to raise our families, putting families first. And I look forward to doing all of that. We have many different voices in our caucus with many different priorities. And I just want to have the opportunity to work with everyone, including the Republicans, once we're past the election or even before. Rep. Schuette, I consider you to be a very moderate, reasonable representative to work with. And I hope we can, continue to reach across the aisle to make Michigan, just the very best place for all of us.
And we got a reader question that I think I can predict both of your answers to about who will win the House. So I will add to that slightly for both of you, and Rep. Cerniglu, we can start with you. Based on the numbers and the what you're looking at in these competitive districts right now, what's the dream scenario for you in November?
Sure. So I'm confident we're going to hold all of our seats that we have. I forgot to note that our candidates, we really are very confident that our candidates fit their districts very well. Some of them are more moderate than others, but they all fit their districts and they all work hard and they're well known in their districts. And when I go knock for them, people know them, they recognize them, they're voting for them. And it's just a very positive experience. But I am also hoping that we pick up a few seats. There's a few that I've got my eye on. Of course, those will be decisions we make, down the line. But I'm really hoping that we pick up a few more seats after November. So that's my dream scenario.
And Rep. Schuette, how about House Republicans? What's the dream scenario for your caucus?
Yeah, and thanks, Lauren. We definitely can have our dream scenarios. I'm focused as chairman of the House Republican Campaign Committee, is doing the work so that way, no matter what happens, we're in a position to win in November. And there's currently 10 seats held by Democrats that Donald Trump won at the top of the ticket between 2016 and 2020. So we have a lot of fertile ground to target for potential pickups. And obviously, my dream scenario is that Republicans sweep all of those races, and including our U.S. Senate race and our presidential race at the top of the ticket. But what I know, and Richard sort of pointed to this earlier, is that Michigan House Republicans, we don't need it to be a 2010 style landslide year for Republicans to take back the state house. We just need it to be a competitive election environment. And we know that Michigan is going to be one of the most hotly contested states in the entire country. And because of that, we're going to be in an environment as the House Republicans where we can pick up the needed to play defense, and then also pick up the needed 2 seats at least to take back the majority. And Penelope, I appreciated your kind words earlier. I've enjoyed working with you this last year, where we can agree and we can disagree without being disagreeable.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, and unless there's any other questions coming in that I haven't seen, I think that's a good spot to end while we're all complimentary of each other. I'm sure it might get a little more competitive and heated on the road. But just want to thank both of our representatives for joining us today, as well as Richard earlier. Really appreciate the thoughtful conversation and the willingness to share where both caucuses are at as we head into a very robust and historic election cycle. So thanks again. Really, really appreciate you taking the time. And I'll
Thank
throw
you.
it back to Jackie, unless I'll throw it back to you, Jackie, unless there's anyone else I'm missing.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you to all of our panelists as well as to all those who tuned in. We will be posting a recording of today's program on Bridge Michigan's website, app, and social media channels this week. So you can see it on many different formats. And our post-primary our lunch break, our next lunch break, pardon me, will be announced very soon. Thanks again and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.